the United States has abdicated its role as, quote, leader of the free world, unquote. Because, I mean, you look at what's happening on the streets in the United States now, and they can no longer call themselves part of the free world, frankly, and certainly not its leader. The absolutely smartest thing the Russians could do is deliver Vladimir Putin to The Hague as a hostess gift for re-entry into the international community.
This is the Lex Pacificatoria podcast with your host, Michael J. Campbell. This is the podcast where we discuss peace, justice, and human rights topics with experts from all over the world.
My name is Michael Campbell, and I'm a PhD student at Western University in London, Ontario. Today, I'm joined by Sabine Nölke. Sabine is a Canadian by choice and conviction, having first lived in Canada as an exchange student before later immigrating with her husband. She joined Global Affairs Canada in 1992 as a Foreign Service Officer, specializing in international peace and security law, human rights, terrorism, the laws of armed conflict, and atrocity crimes. Throughout her career, she played a key role in shaping Canada's disarmament and non-proliferation policy. From 2015 to 2019, she served as Canada's ambassador to the Netherlands. Since her retirement, she has served as a consultant to Global Affairs Canada on a number of projects. This episode has been sponsored by Western University's Academy of Advanced Research and their 2025 theme, Possibilities for Peace in the 21st Century. The goal of this research center is to break down barriers between academic disciplines and get at the various root causes of conflict and work together to provide lasting peace-building solutions. At its core, this vision aligns with what legal scholar Christine Bell describes as Lex Pacificatoria, or in English, peacemaking law. As Western Academy is interested in mobilizing their expertise out of the Academy and into public spaces, this collaboration between the podcast and the Academy is both natural and mutually beneficial. Western Academy has assembled a diverse team including emerging and established scholars whose work spans law, political science, literature, women's and gender studies, and peace and conflict studies. The Academy has also welcomed former diplomats in the Canadian Foreign Service as visiting fellows. Sabine Nölke is one of these fellows. For more information, visit the link in the show notes or search the web for Western Academy of Advanced Research. As a reminder, the discussion we are having today takes place outside of any official teaching or research duties we may have. Sabine, thank you for making the time to talk with me today. To start off, what influenced you to get involved in international law?
That's a good question. It's actually should probably be rephrased as what convinced you to stay in international law. When I started out in government, it was to get away from the practice of law. I did not want to be a lawyer anymore. I decided that private practice wasn't for me. So long story short, I ended up writing the Foreign Service exam and then being told on day one that, well, you're a lawyer, so we're going to send you to the legal bureau. And I almost walked back out, but it took me about 4 weeks and I fell in love with international law. And that is the point from where I can answer your question. What fascinated me about it? It is the blend of politics and law. International law is very much a work in progress. It is predicated on the consent of states to be bound by it. And therefore, I mean, that consent can shift, contexts shift, geopolitical realities move. And so it is very much a work in progress. And it is that part that fascinated me. And I was lucky enough in my career to be at a number of inflection points where we could actually shape international law. These days, of course, we're in days of retrenchment. The rules-based international system is under grave threat. And I don't know how international law will look like in the next decade. But I'm certainly a very keen observer and try to continue to provide my views and my input where I can.
Yeah, and we'll certainly get into what international law is looking like these days in due course. But my next question is, how did you get established with a career in international law? You mentioned that you wrote the Foreign Service exam. What were some of the next steps, and how did you get your foot in the door?
I think I didn't have to put a foot in the door. The door was wide open and I was sucked in by a vortex beyond my control, really. The year that I was recruited into the Foreign Service, they only accepted people with a law degree or an MBA because those were the shortages that the system had identified. So when I became a Foreign Service officer on day one, I found myself in the legal bureau, and not entirely, as I said earlier, not entirely voluntarily. What caused me to stay in it, of course, as I mentioned, was the fascination. The work is incredibly important, interesting, and dare I say, occasionally even fun, especially when you're faced with new situations that look like a law exam, but it's real life and you have to resolve it on the spot. And then you have to give advice to ministers, and they do what you suggest they do. It's quite an intellectual high, I have to say. How did I build the career? I mean, essentially, I started out my first year in trade law, trade and economic law, and I didn't find that particularly exciting. It was before NAFTA. I'm that old. So we had the bilateral trade agreement between Canada and the US in place, and I worked on a couple of disputes under that agreement. That really wasn't my cup of tea. I wasn't in the business, I think, of international law to make people more money. I was interested in the issues that affect ordinary people around the globe. So when a job opening came up in international peace and security, I grabbed it with both hands. And that was in the year 1993, which of course coincided with the splintering of the former Yugoslavia, the Yugoslav secession wars, the genocides in Bosnia, Srebrenica, and then 1994, the next year, we had the genocide in Rwanda. So I was essentially in the place where I provided advice on the government on critical issues of the day, and was able as well to help shape the international community's response to those issues. I provided some submissions by Canada, for example, to the creation of the Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia. This was the first criminal tribunal internationally that was established since Nuremberg, since the Nuremberg trials. And the newly appointed judges asked states to make suggestions and recommendations as to what they should be putting into rules of evidence and procedure, because this was brand new. And I was lucky enough to make a few suggestions on those issues that were subsequently accepted, including on protection of witnesses of gender-based violence and similar fact evidence, patterns of conduct establishing intent to commit specific crimes. So, of course, after that, I was hooked. I could help Canada's response to some of these international crises, and that was it didn't pay very well, but the work was just incredibly valuable and exciting and professionally very rewarding.
Yeah, you mentioned two major accomplishments there, working with the criminal tribunals. Is there anything that stands out as something that you're most proud of accomplishing throughout your career in international law?
There are a few. I mean, the one that I mentioned, the submission of rules of evidence, at least one of the rules that I drafted for the tribunal was imported almost verbatim and led to a couple of convictions of war criminals, of Serbian war criminals. So that, but of course, I mean, my name isn't attached to any of this, so there's no, Sabine Nölke achievement. It's just something that I know I had a bit of a hand in. The drafting of a couple of international treaties. One was the UN Convention on the Suppression of Terrorist Bombings, which was actually at the time we were still coordinating as a G8. Russia was still part of it. This was in the 1990s when we actually coordinated things with a Russia that was opening to the West. And we drafted the convention, and then I got to negotiate it on behalf of Canada in the context of the UN Sixth Committee. So that was a good one. Drafting large chunks of the protocols to the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, specifically the ones on migrant smuggling, on trafficking in human beings, and trafficking in firearms. Again, I had a fairly strong hand in drafting some of the provisions that made its way into the final treaties, and I can point to those, and that is very rewarding, of course. Most recently, I think one of the really fun and interesting and challenging things we did was in the context of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons when I was ambassador in the Netherlands, because I was also the permanent representative to the OPCW at the time. And of course, that was at a time when Syria was throwing around chemical weapons at its own people. And there was no mechanism for accountability. There had been one briefly established by the UN Security Council, but then the Russians vetoed its extension. So this mechanism was dead. And fortunately, at the OPCW, decisions do not have to be made by consensus of all the states parties, and there is no veto. So it was an effort, a diplomatic effort, a huge diplomatic lift, actually, that allowed us to outflank Russia and its supporters in establishing not an accountability mechanism, but an investigative mechanism that could lead to a future accountability mechanism. And now, of course, that there has been a regime change in Syria. The materials that were gathered by the evidence gathered by that investigative mechanism can be turned over to Syrian authorities that might be interested in prosecuting, or a hybrid or international body that might be created to prosecute crimes against humanity committed in Syria. And then the second exercise in that context was when Russia smeared Novichok nerve agent on a doorknob in Salisbury, England. Technically an act of war, because you're not supposed to be, use force on the territory of another state, but we let that one slide in the interest of not starting World War III. But at the same time, this chemical agent was not listed as a prohibited chemical in the context of the Chemical Weapons Convention. So jointly with the United States and the Netherlands, Canada started an effort to amend the Chemical Weapons Convention to include that particular agent. And again, there was a very large diplomatic lift. And of course, the Russians were not keen on it. So, but we got it done. And at some personal risk, disinformation campaigns, cyber attacks, et cetera, but we got it done. And I'm pretty proud of that.
And so I would imagine over the course of your career, mentorship and guidance played a key role in some of the success that you've seen. Are there any key mentors or thinkers that shaped your career?
Yes. I have two people within global affairs who I considered my North Stars. My immediate manager on several occasions, former legal advisor, actually he was legal advisor twice to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Alan Kessel, who to me modeled personal integrity, caring for staff, giving credit where credit is due, providing the proper advice and advice that political level needs to hear as opposed to wants to hear. And that is a critical distinction from time to time, I can tell you that. So Alan, absolutely. I've always said to people, when I grow up, I want to be like Alan Kessel. So he was a big one. The other one is now a senator on the Foreign Relations Committee, Peter Beam, who was one of our deputy ministers at Global Affairs throughout much of my career. And again, sterling integrity, smart, fantastic administrator. I'll just give you a little example. Parental leave was starting to be a thing, not maternity leave, but also for men to take time off to spend time with their children. And at the time, within global affairs, there was a bit of an ethos of you just don't ever leave your desk. You work all the overtime in the world, sometimes without charging. You're always available 24/7, 7 days a week. And Peter took parental leave when he was an assistant deputy minister. And I actually overheard a discussion between two male colleagues in the hallway. And one of them literally said, if Peter can do it, then I can do it. And that's leadership. That's real leadership. But also substantively, Peter has just been amazing. You will know, of course, that with the public service, I mean, the ethos is fearless advice, loyal implementation. And the fearless advice part sometimes is lacking. And both Alan and Peter modeled for me that if you don't have your integrity when you give your advice to the people who need to implement the decisions, need to make the decisions, you have nothing. And that to me is, I think, the single greatest gift that these two men have given me. And I'm very proud to call them my models, my mentors, my North Stars.
Recently, there's been a lot of talk of what it means to be Canadian. In your international work, how did you consider your Canadian identity, and what did that look like on the international stage?
Well, when I started out, I mean, Canada had a reputation to be the, quote, honest broker, unquote. We're, kind of American without the baggage. We are kind of European in outlook without being European. So, and we tended to have a reputation for being reasonable and interested in the common good as opposed to flogging our own agenda. I mean, sometimes, of course, we did have an agenda, but a lot of the time we really wanted to make the world a better place. I mean, it's a cliche, but it's also quite true. I don't think that has changed. What has changed over the years is our ability to actually live up to that. And frankly, when as a Canadian diplomat you come up with a bright idea, you better have to be able to walk the walk at the end of the day. And pretty chronic underfunding, I think, has hobbled us in a number of areas. We have not been able to follow up with money the great things that we suggested the international community do. So that's one. The other one is then, of course, you have changes in government, and then all of a sudden your rhetoric changes, and you can lose credibility when you make a 180 on certain issues, and or become silent on issues that you've been championing until 6 weeks ago. And so that's been a bit of a problem. And then trying to claw that back, but without the financial backing under the next government has been a bit tricky. So we still have a good reputation, but we also have a reputation for people that talk more than they walk.
Did you know that Patreon members get early access to episodes, bonus clips, and other great perks? Check out free and paid membership options at lexbonus.org/Patreon.
And so, with increased rhetoric about nations pursuing an expansionist agenda, how does this disturb the balance of powers in the international legal order?
Well, it's kind of upends the balance, especially since the United States, who has been traditionally an advocate for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of other states, has all of a sudden started to sound like Vladimir Putin vis-a-vis Russia. So that requires a big realignment. I mean, it certainly was a huge wake-up call for us here in Canada, when all of a sudden this 51st state talk started happening, and it was clearly not a joke. When the United States started voting at the UN General Assembly with Russia on a resolution that was intended to condemn Russian aggression against Ukraine, and voted in the negative. Those are scary times. And so what is happening essentially is that the North Atlantic Alliance that I think the Western states have relied upon for the last 80 years has seriously frayed. The United States has abdicated its role as, quote, leader of the free world, unquote, because, I mean, you look at what's happening on the streets in the United States now, and they can no longer call themselves part of the free world, frankly, and certainly not its leader. Canada will have to look for new alliances. We need to strengthen our ties with Europe. We need to build our own resilience. So economic and security wise, psychologically. So it's been a wake-up call. China, of course, is chuckling because if the United States is no longer interested in defending state sovereignty, that leaves Taiwan exposed. So it's, scary days.
And so, do you think moving forward, Canada can continue to call the United States an ally? And if not, who are our new strongest allies in this changing order?
Yeah, I think we're past the ally stage, unfortunately. I mean, certainly not as a reliable ally. Economically, we're no longer a partner. And there's a clear, I mean, just today, new acts of hostility by the Trump government. So our friends these days are the EU and the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, the other members of the Western group, including the ones not in the EU, like Norway, the Nordics particularly, especially as we're looking at shoring up our presence in the Arctic. The Nordics are going to become more and more relevant to us. So some of our Asian partners, I think Japan, South Korea. So, and I think we should probably also look to some non-traditional allies in Latin America, for example. I mean, we have free trade agreements with much of Latin America, but our political ties need to be strengthened, because there's some hemispheric issues now at play. So we do need to look further. And I think it's a good day to be a diplomat because you can start building new alliances, and it should be a challenging time. But the United States has proven its unreliability to the point of hostility.
Every nation brings to the table their own interests. And so in the process of international diplomacy, how do you persuade a foreign nation to act in your interest without breaking those unwritten rules and acting with hostility or acting with force?
Well, I think the biggest, diplomacy is a loaded term. I was a practitioner of diplomacy on the ground, but ultimately, of course, major decisions, all decisions are made at the political table, and there's a level of diplomacy that I am not a part of. But when you are, shall we say, trying to convince other states to act in your interest as a diplomat, like when I was ambassador in the Netherlands, for example, the biggest element you need is trust. If the partners or your interlocutors think that you have a hidden agenda, they don't trust a word you're saying, and it makes it difficult for them to get agreement. So you have to lay your cards on the table to the extent possible, and not obfuscate, not lie. I think that's really important. It's ultimately a personal interaction that you have. I may be sitting behind a sign that says Canada, but I'm still me. And if people don't trust me, then they won't do business with me. So that's the big thing. But also how you do the convincing, of course, you have to convince your partners that there's something in it for them. And diplomacy is a game of give and take. Nobody wants to just take or wants to just give everything away to you for free, for nothing. So the question of what is in it for country X. So you have to make sure that you find common cause. Yes, this is in Canada's interest, but here's the reason why it's also in Namibia's interest or in South Korea's interest, etc. Shared values, shared commitments under international law, shared commercial or economic interests, shared security interests. So you have to bring those out, and they change, of course, from interlocutor to interlocutor. So you have to be fairly well informed when you make your interventions, so that you don't, step on political landmines inadvertently.
Yeah, you've suggested that the United States has acted hostilely. How does this change how you engage with the United States in diplomacy?
The Trump administration, as such, is very difficult to move. They're coming coming to issues from a point of ideology, not necessarily rationality. And they have shown that they're not trustworthy. So where we need to shift our diplomacy is to the state level, particularly when it comes to the economic coercion that Trump is seeking to carry on vis-a-vis Canada in order to, get us to surrender and allow ourselves to be taken over. The states, of course, understand the value of Canada as an economic commercial partner and as a security partner. And you will see that diplomacy, intervening with governors, with state houses, is already bearing some fruit. You have a number of state houses that have passed resolutions expressing how much they value Canada as a trading partner. Because, they stand to suffer from some of the tariffs that Trump has imposed as well. So that's really, you have to kind of drop down your diplomacy to a different level and then hope that percolates back up, because Trump will not listen to Prime Minister Carney. He may listen to, a governor from, particularly if it's from a red state, and Andy Beshear in Kentucky is running in circles because his bourbon industry is, deflating rapidly because its largest buyer is blocking it, Ontario. So you need the Andy Beshears to pick up the phone and say, wait a minute, guys, can we please, chill a little bit here? So that's how the diplomacy shifts. Individually, of course, individual US diplomats are the same people that they were, 6 months ago, with the exception, of course, ambassadors who've been fired and new people rotated in. But I have some very good friends in the State Department, and they're still working for the State Department. So when I talk to them, I'm still talking to, I would still be talking to the same person who was on my side last summer. So you have to be careful and extend them some grace, because their instructions, of course, have changed. But you can still do some business. If it's not politically loaded, you can do some business with them.
It seems like the new administration in the United States is different than anything that we've seen before. Is there a difference in international diplomacy with that first Trump administration versus what we're seeing now with this current administration?
Yes. The first administration, his worst impulses were still constrained by people with some professional background who were still operating within given norms and standards and behaviors. The gloves have come off, I think, as far as he's gotten much worse, and I can't put too fine a point on that. He seems to think that when the US Supreme Court said he would have immunity from criminal prosecution for acts committed in the conduct of his office, he understands that to mean that everything he does is legal. And that's not the same thing. Immunity from criminal prosecution doesn't mean the things that you do are now suddenly legal. They're still illegal. It just means you can't be personally thrown in jail for them. So that is, I think, a distinction that I do hope the Supreme Court will make in the next major case that will come before it. And there's already cases percolating up to the top. He no longer has advisors who actually know what they're doing. A Fox newscaster, a Secretary of Defense, he has nothing to contribute of value. And I think we've just seen that in the last few days. And then especially if you feel that you can operate without accountability, when mistakes are clearly made, instead of fixing those and changing your behavior, the administration now doubles down and makes it worse. So they're essentially undermining their own legitimacy and their own credibility on a daily basis, which makes it really, really difficult to find anything as an interlocutor to grapple onto. It is all, I want this, and you give me this or else. We're essentially now as far as the senior level of U.S. diplomacy is concerned, in a game of thuggery. Yeah, that's the best I can describe it. So traditional diplomacy does not work. You'll have to find different and new pressure points. And again, changing those pressure points by having them come from the ground up through the states, I think is where we're going to have to shift to.
In international diplomacy, it's important to understand how foreign leaders think. So, what is the role in thinking like a foreign leader? And does this risk, introducing your own biases into that thinking?
I mean, ultimately, if you listen to only one analyst, then yes, you get a bias. If you listen to a number of analysts and you consult with allies and with their analysts, then I think you can triangulate a far more realistic picture. So silly is the leader who will listen to only one voice, I think is my simple answer to that one. I think the greatest weakness of ideological regimes is that they will only listen to information that confirms their own biases. And that is ultimately why they always fail.
What do you think the biggest threats to global security are today?
Oh dear. You mean apart from the potential implosion of NATO, and the United States becoming a rogue state? So we can shelve those because we talked about it. I think to me, one of the biggest things that we have not brought under control is cybersecurity, disinformation, the uncontrolled spread of lies. We've lost some of the norms, including in our own Canadian political sphere. We have certain politicians who absolutely have no issue standing in front of a microphone and lying through their teeth, whether by commission or omission. So that is a grave difficulty for me, and it's a societal change, where everybody's opinion is given the same weight as somebody else's expertise. So the disregard for expertise and knowledge, and its substitution by opinions and vibes, and I feel this is the case, and therefore it is the case. That has made some of the particularly shifts to the right possible. Is the unconstrained misinformation, lies, and the unwillingness of people to actually look for truth, to listen to a single source of information and say, yes, that is so. I mean, there have been studies done that people who watch Fox News are less informed about current events than if they had not watched any news at all. And that's pretty problematic. And to conduct domestic politics, to make domestic policy, and to conduct international relations on the basis of not just lack of information, but false information is pretty troubling to me. And finally, it has amounted in some cases to active warfare. I mean, you have the troll farms in St. Petersburg, for example, who are seeding the Western public square with misinformation. It is not an act of force within the definition of international law, but it certainly is an act that is aimed at undermining the sovereignty of the states who are being targeted by the misinformation. So there's a new form of very insidious hybrid warfare that has started that we haven't really learned how to counter yet.
Given the recent arrest warrants for possible war crimes in Gaza and the recent arrest of Rodrigo Duterte, are you optimistic about the future of international criminal justice?
I'm as optimistic as I've ever been. I mean, it only works as much as states will allow it to work. But again, political change happens. And as Martin Luther King said, the arc of the universe bends towards justice. When I started at Global Affairs in the mid-90s, we had a poster on the wall in our open area with indictments, the pictures of indictees of the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia. And every time somebody was arrested, we'd make an X through it. And by the time I left, there was only Well, no, Milosevic was left. Karadzic and Mladic, all the lesser ones had been caught. But then all of a sudden, regime change in Serbia, and Milosevic was on a plane to The Hague. And then when I was ambassador in The Hague, I watched the verdict against Karadzic, Radovan Karadzic, live in 2016. This was almost 20 years after the establishment of the tribunal. He was brought to justice. Duterte, I mean, the Philippines withdrew while I was in The Hague from the ICC, but of course, the crimes are still covered under the jurisdiction that existed at the time. And here he is in The Hague. So yes, the mills grind slowly, but they do grind. And if there is a regime change in Russia, the absolutely smartest thing the Russians could do is deliver Vladimir Putin to The Hague as a hostess gift for re-entry into the international community, essentially, which is basically what Serbia did. They wanted to have rapprochement with Europe, so here have Milosevic. So yes, I'm optimistic, cautiously, but optimistic.
It sounds like being an optimist is kind of a key trait for someone engaged in international law. What do you think some of the other key traits for successful diplomats or successful lawyers on the international stage are?
Yeah, you're absolutely right about optimism, because if you're a pessimist, then, why bother? You may as well just go home and knit. Key traits, I think, for a good diplomat is you have to leave your biases behind, or at the very least, be conscious of them. Because especially when you're dealing with multilateral diplomacy, every state that comes to the table, and there's 193 of them, comes with their own perspective. And if you're incapable of not only perceiving, but also appreciating that perspective, you will never be able to negotiate effectively. I mean, as I said earlier, you have to, if you want to have your way, you have to find a way of making that the other state's way as well. So if you don't understand what their way is, you can't be as persuasive. So you have to be open to different perspectives. You have to be respectful. And this is something that is sorely lacking in the Trump administration right now. They're just basically throwing their weight around, which makes everybody not want to give them what they want, basically. I mean, that's how you deal with bullies, is you don't give them what they want. So so you have to understand what the other side sees in a given issue. You have to be clear, you have to be honest. I mean, obviously, you can't, divulge necessarily your entire hand when you play it. You have to know where your red lines actually are, and not try and take a lot more than it is that you need from a negotiation, because that will cause bad faith in the other side, and it'll cause bad blood, basically. So perspective, trust, transparency. It helps if you speak more than one language, and you have to be willing to meet people where they are, rather than try and drag them kicking and screaming to another place.
What would you say to someone who's disillusioned with the state of international law and international affairs?
I get that question a fair bit, usually phrased differently. It's that international law doesn't work. Why do you work in it? And to which my response is always, every time you lick a stamp and put it on a letter and send that letter to Europe, international law is working for you. Every time you pick up the phone and call somebody who is not in Canada, international law is working for you. Every time you eat a banana, international law is working for you. So as a framework, it is very much present. But of course, when it works, people don't see it. So when I get your disillusioned person before me, I will read them a long litany of where it actually does work for them. And it tends to open eyes, because people only look at, the dysfunctionality of the UN Security Council. That's the tip of the iceberg. It's a shiny, bright, sharp tip, of course, and it makes life difficult. But if the Security Council doesn't act, the General Assembly can, and it will. The mechanism for Syria that was established on the fact-finding of the human rights violations was established by the General Assembly. The resolution condemning Russian aggression against Ukraine and saying that Ukraine was entitled to reparations was done by the General Assembly. So if you carry out diplomacy well, you can still get results even on political issues from the United Nations. The UN development system works really well. The World Health Organization, that the Americans have just quit again, works really well. When they declared the pandemic, a whole lot of other things flowed from that. Development assistance to countries who couldn't produce their own vaccines, and et cetera, et cetera. So the system still holds. It's only where it becomes political that there are issues. But as a framework, international law is there to stay, and we have to make sure that it continues to work for us.
What advice would you give a young person who's interested in getting involved in international law?
Oh, well, I may not be the best person because I kind of, like I mentioned at the very beginning, I kind of fell into it. I didn't even study international law at school, at university, because I didn't think I would ever have a job where it was relevant, frankly. Well, funny that. Yeah, I think, first of all, do take a few courses, but also be aware when you take those courses that the practice of international law is nothing like the academic view of it. Volunteer or, find an internship and learn the world firsthand. I always say to people, no education that you ever have is a waste. My first degrees were in English literature. Does that have anything to do with international law? Not really, but it makes me one hell of an effective drafter, because I know language and I can read from statements. I can pick up the pieces where the actual nuggets of intent lie hidden. So, learn as much as you can, as broad a spectrum as you can, because again, in order to be able to understand the perspective of other countries, you have to know something of them. So if all you do is study law, you're not going to learn a thing. So widen your perspective, read, talk, watch, and do as much as you can. And in terms of hiring decisions, I've seen hundreds of resumes come across my desk with, the little cover letters, and there would often be from students, I would be perfect for a job in your area because I've taken the following 4 courses. Yeah, you and 98 of the other 100 that just sent me this letter. So find ways of distinguishing yourself through experience and knowledge as opposed to paper credentials.
If there's one message that listeners take away from hearing you today, what would you want that message to be?
Be interested in the world, because the world is more interested in you than you would like to think. In other words, don't think that when you're watching TV that what happens out there on the other side of the planet has nothing to do with you. It does. We're living on the same planet. So we have to find a way of living on it and getting along with each other. Again, that sounds like a cliche, but it's the truth.
Is there anything that I haven't yet asked you that you'd like an opportunity to speak about?
No, I think it's been pretty comprehensive. I think the only message that I would give is to Canadians who perhaps are listening at this point is be wary of political agendas being used to try and explain external events. And what I mean by that is, it's very clear, for example, that inflation over the last 4 years was the result of the pandemic. It wasn't the result of political decisions made at the domestic level in every country. I mean, you had the same accusations flying in the United States that you had flying in Canada from the other side. The same thing will happen now with Trump's tariffs. Don't allow political agendas to tear apart the coherent national response that we need to those attacks from the outside.
And finally, where can listeners find you online?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn under my name. I'm on Blue Sky under my name. And I'm on Substack as well. So you should be able to find me fairly easily.
And links to those will be in the show notes. Thanks so much for your time today.
You're very welcome, Michael. It's been a pleasure.